brought you here today for an obvious reason, an obvious purpose, and that is to for you to tell us how much the people of Cuba hate the current administration, hate communism, and want America to come in and fucking save themselves,
Right.
save Cuba.
Well, I would start by saying that the situation, like as like it's all like very fluid, and I think like sort of like the baseline understanding that we have, that sort of at least like that at least I've talked about with people I know in Cuba and other people who are watching this closely. It's that there is a real sense of concern and worry over the destabilizing effect that things like this like hashtag campaign has. And obviously that like everybody from the U.S. government, official channels like Joe Biden himself, down to every like Republican elected that you can imagine, as well as most Democrats, frankly. So that's really fucking concerning. It's not good, because like the basis of these protests, as they're being called, is that there is a like there are vaccine shortages and a lot of blackouts and other shortages of necessary supplies, and it's like there are like, all of that is true, except it's not for lack of trying. In that Cuba has developed and plans to export an effective vaccine that it was able to bring to trial. And then, secondly, like there's the 60-year embargo slash blockade that effectively makes it illegal for Cuba, for businesses to sell things to Cuba in most basic aspects. And so, during times like a pandemic, where you have a country like Cuba that is reliant very heavily on tourism for its economy, and you have a pandemic, like totally throw something like that out of whack. As one of the people that we've interviewed for Blowback says at one point, like like fissures emerge, and as I think we sort of talk about in our show, the American government has a long history of exploiting those fissures when it can.
So, you want to briefly talk about the like what encompasses the Cuban embargo? Because a lot of people in the chat and all over the internet that fancy themselves to be neoliberal State Department employees that work for free for the American propaganda machine will say that the Cuban embargo doesn't cover medical supplies, actually. So you're wrong. It's not that crippling. It's just on wealthy people. I mean, this is something we hear about the embargo on Venezuela as well, and the sanctions on Venezuela as well. Is that like, well, it's always just directed towards the wealthy people who are the corrupt leaders, and no one else. So do you mind talking about that a little bit?
Yeah, I think that sort of like the, in the first season of Blowback, we talked about Iraq and how the sanctions in the 90s, like had crippled many of the essential institutions that, were able to serve Iraqi society. A key point there, something that's not unrelated, or that you see also in Cuba, is the destruction of the electricity system. And if you're a modern state, like everything from water filtration to obviously like telecommunications depends on a functioning electrical grid. And also you have to have like the natural resources to power that electrical grid and so on. And so I think that in general, these sanctions, when people say that they're targeted, they're lying, because if you look at the sanctions themselves, they say the legislation spells out quite plainly just how not targeted they are. Because if they were targeted, they wouldn't be effective. So what would be the point of having them in the first place? And to that point, I think that like the embargo, it's worth sort of observing the history of what the embargo is and where it comes from, which is that the embargo was initiated by John F. Kennedy in as like this like or rather sorry, it was initiated by Dwight Eisenhower shortly before he leaves office and before Kennedy is inaugurated. And so for 60 years, there's just been this like this thing in place that was initially introduced, as we sort of talk about in our show, as part of an escalation toward what was realistically going to be an invasion, an American sanctioned invasion and counter-revolution in Cuba. And so it's like this instrument that we used as like as a tool to prepare a country for an invasion, is still in place, and it's, if anything, it's just like, it's fucking astonishing that Cuban society has held together, and that the Cuban government and the Cuban Revolution has persevered in the way that it has under those conditions, particularly once the Soviet Union was gone, and Cuba, overnight lost, like, like something, I think, like, I think like 80% of its imports and export, like its primary trading partners, are gone overnight. And so
Yeah.
I think that there is like there's a standard that Americans, when they look at these protests, that, like, they're conditioned, like, for whether or not the protests are legitimate is a separate question. Like, when we see discontent in Cuba, we are inclined to lay it at the blame of, like we're inclined to blame, the Cuban government, and say, oh, look at that, we got to change things in Cuba, make it better for them, etc. But it's like, well, like, no, there's this thing that we're doing that we can change all on our own, that would immediately improve the lives of the 11 million people who live there, and that would be to end the embargo slash blockade. The terms are used a bit interchangeably, although I guess technically it is an embargo,
Yeah.
because a blockade is like a military. It's like involves like, but it's, where words are fluid is the important part.
Noah, you're using your headphone microphone, right? This is unrelated, but
No, I'm using a Zoom mic. Is it not loud?
you're it's like it's just like bass boosted. I don't know how to describe it. It's
How about this?
I have a bunch of little babies in the chat. I'm sure you know already, and they're being incredibly fucking annoying about it. So you want to
What
check
about?
them, you want to check to make sure if maybe your gain's too high or something.
Yeah, that's what I'm turning down now. Is this any better?
Wait, turn it down as much as you can. Like, let me and give me some.
I'm talking right now. How's this?
No, it's still like very. I don't know why. It's like, I think maybe your Discord audio is coming from somewhere else. Do you want to like restructure it? Maybe.
Give me one moment. Yeah.
Sorry to just like cut you off in the middle of your convo,
All
but
right. How's this?
wait, keep speaking, keep talking.
Is this better?
It seems like it's the same, but we'll see. It's fine. Let's just keep going.
Okay.
So,
Yeah.
okay, it's a little bit quieter, which is not bad. Let me hear it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so for the record, for those of for the people who are like wondering how the embargo works, like to give a little bit more detail into it, like even if the American government allows goods and supplies and commodities to get into Cuba, they still will take ships, lock them down for months at a time. A process that's actually very costly to the American government as well, for the record. Whether it be like legal battles that they consistently have to fight, or just like literally holding ships under lockdown for an extended period of time. And then they'll allow these ships to potentially go through after checking all the cargo, shit like that. So there's, it's not necessarily, like whenever people say, oh, well, medical supplies are allowed through, you have to remember that like there's still a significant setback there. And not only that, but it's also completely unacceptable. And the world leaders and other nations who are so used to turning a blind eye to atrocities committed by Western imperialist nations, even they find this to be completely unacceptable, with the exception of Israel and the United States of America. All other countries have asked the United States to lift the embargo on Cuba.
Totally. And it's also sort of worth mentioning, I think, that like there is a sort of longstanding tradition. There's like a more moderate wing of, what could be called like the Cuban American community, that believes very strongly that like there is a, like, once we end the embargo, we're going to win over Cuba to capitalism, in some sort of good faith fashion. And I think that like there is just sort of like, there's a reason that there are people who tout that line. And it's because like, yeah, if you just ended the embargo, this thing that would actually be like this huge drain of resources would go away. But I think that, this is where it gets into the question of like, well, then why does this thing exist, right? Like if it doesn't actually accomplish the goal of, I mean, as of yet, over 60 years in dislodging the Cuban Revolution, and it, is not something that is economically productive under in any defensible terms. I think that I guess the way I would put it, like, is that lost my train of thought. Um, I guess the way that I would put it is that honestly, I saw somebody say something about my shelf, and it like really fucked with my head. I made like the number one mistake of
No,
like
you
going on
you
somebody's
never
Facebook
read
link.
chat, brother. You know this.
I know. It was like my big mistake.
And now you
You know,
admitted that you're reading chat, so now they're gonna fucking go crazy.
I mean, yeah. Now I'm just not going to. Now I've just like turned it
Just
out. And I'm like
yeah.
staring somewhere else. You know, the why is the embargo in place and this whole infrastructure against Cuba in place? It's because you know, for example, there's TV Marti or the National Endowment for Democracy, which are American government funded institutions. TV Marti and Radio Marti are Florida based media outlets that are staffed, but they're basically, I've described them like this before. They are make work programs for Miami Cubans to broadcast propaganda that nobody listens to. But you know, one of the guests that I've interviewed, this guy who's actually the lawyer for Elian Gonzalez's father in 1999,
Uh huh.
um, he 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 told me that there was this, as he described it, like a Miami distortion field, and that, you know, there is this cottage industry and this incredibly influential like very in a very visible public way, and there are obviously, you know, other interests, or you know, they're not the only interests on this, and I don't want to portray that this is like a, you know, it's monocausal, but like there is a cottage industry that exists in a Cuba lobby, you know, like they want the embargo to exist, and you know, this is not an unheard of tradition. You know, for example, in 1962, after the Bay of Pigs, a bunch of, you know, the majority of the most hardcore Miami Cubans, the majority of them actually said that they did not want the U.S. government negotiating for the return of the 1,500 or the 1,000 plus people that the Cuban government had captured after the Bay of Pigs, because they, you know, they thought that like negotiating for the release of, you know, their brothers, sons, fathers, etc., was a sign of accommodation. So, you know, this is a very, very hardline group of people in terms of the costs that they're willing to incur. You know, and that's not even getting into the acts of terrorism that they have been a part of and operated in concert with the American government. You know, in the decades since.
Yeah. Um, what do you have to say to people that claim that Cuban Americans that have these incredibly reactionary takes are representative of the plight that Cubans are going through in Cuba right now, beyond what you just described?
Yeah, I think that it's a, you know, like there's a couple of different challenges there. The first of which is that it's like there is a version that's not just from, you know, Cuban Americans, right, but it's from like the whole media, that is just a narrative, which is that like Cubans are denied a bunch of freedoms, and America, to positive end, is calling for Cubans to be given those freedoms, and there's this discontent on the streets, and so on and so on. And you know, another part of that narrative, and the way that we're able to establish, you know, the fact supposedly, that's the first part of that, which is about like, you know, what are these freedoms that are taken away. The way in which that is framed as presented by, you know, the Cuban exiles is often just incorrect or misguided. You know, I think that, for example, the very existence of, you know, outlets dedicated to putting out propaganda for the overthrow of the Castro regime, in addition to many of the ongoing, you know, very active and publicly, and you know, like acknowledged anti-Castro efforts that are underway, you know, taken by the American government. Um, to me, I guess it's you know, there is a way in which it's like the community of people who are often most trying to say, because of my experience, you know, this and this, Castro and that, are often the people who, when you look at what that experience is, you know, they're the people who participated in or end up supporting, you know, what I think are some of the really, you know, straight up darker chapters of the Cuban American history. And I think that to me, you know, the weaponization by the American government of the Cuban American community is, you know, a conversation that's long since passed. And, you know, I as somebody who's reported in the past on, you know, the pro-Israel lobby for Jewish publications, it's a kind of like diaspora politics that felt very familiar to me when Brendan and I were digging into this subject.
Would you say that they're Batista supporters? Because that's the part that
No.
often people leave out, is this notion that the Cuban Revolution was incredibly violent, horrible, and Cuba in the aftermath suffered greatly, but they neglect to mention what Cuba looked like before the Cuban Revolution and before Fidel Castro's regime, and how oppressive and incredibly violent it was at the behest of American capital owners, whether it be the mafia with casinos or whether it be just rich people in general that took advantage of plantations in Cuba and the slavery. This is something that rarely ever gets mentioned. So I think it's important to mention that as well. The like what preceded the Castro administration.
So, it's a really, you brought up one really important point, which is about like, like how violent was the Cuban Revolution? And there is this memory of, like, a bunch of like, middle class shopkeepers alongside, the landed gentry being lined up in the street and shot. And that's just not how it went. In fact, and this is something that we talk about in the episode that's available this week, Lo Hicimos, no, actually, this will be in next week's episode. But the Cuban Revolution was not actually as violent as the 1933 coup, which the American government had, officially been okay with, which actually saw the rise of Batista for the first time in the 1930s, and the fall of the Cuban dictator Machado. And so I think that like it's you're absolutely right to say that like yes, like there's this kind of I think a fake memory that exists in American culture and in American popular perception about what the Cuban Revolution was there, and then simultaneously, like to that point, I think one of the things that is really sort of I guess like underemphasized in this also is that like the revolution itself and the July 26th movement was a diverse thing. You'll find a lot of people, who were, some of the most later vociferous anti-Castro, anti-Cuban revolution or counter-revolutionary straight up. They began as, supposed fellow travelers of Castro, and or at least of the Cuban Revolution, because, in large part, when Batista fell, the country, as you were saying, it was deeply unequal. It was totally broken. And the fact that it had fallen and that the Americans had not lined up a sure thing by the time Batista fell, to replace him as they had in the past, was sort of like a black eye. Like the state of Cuba was just so obviously screwed up in terms of how impoverished the countryside was and how unequal Havana was, and the rampant corruption, the presence of American gangsters, and so on. And so after the revolution, begins. So from 1950 into 1960, up until the Bay of Pigs, over the course of that, I guess 2 years almost, but really less than 2 years, 18 months functionally, you have a lot of Cubans leaving the island, and you have a lot of people who are going to the United States. Or you have a lot of, and so, but with the encouragement of the United States, there's a CIA plot to scare Cubans into sending their children to the United States called Operation Peter Pan. And the idea of, just sort of like the once again, I get so deep in this, I lose where I am. But I guess to bring it back a little bit, I guess the thing that I would sort of emphasize about where the memory of how violent the revolution is, and is important to dispel, is to suggest about like the people that we sort of weaponize and who are Batista cronies that we weaponize later. That's what I was getting to. The Batista cronies who are who at all were both Batista cronies and former fellow travelers of the revolution. They do end up joining forces, and are both part of the Brigade 2506 and so on. So it's like there are many people who will say, yeah, I was one of the liberal revolutionaries, but then Castro, he went commie, and it's like, well, what was it? What do you mean when you say he went commie? Do you mean that he nationalized the land in ways that were unfavorable to the corporate interests, and like thus sort of induced a natural showdown with the United States, which previously got to treat Cuba like its plaything? I like it's. I just have a hard. I think that when confronted with the facts about that kind of thing, are sort of hard put to defend it, and so they're forced to sort of mischaracterize what the revolution was and what it meant when it took place.
I wanna qualify something here as well to the people who consistently talk about the number of deaths under the Cuban Revolution or under the Castro regime, which was I guess around for what 60 years, and in comparison to the casualties under Batista for the period in time that Batista was in power, which was 7 years, give or take, was, according to the CIA at the very least, 20,000 people. Whereas the Cuban Castro regime has never come anywhere near that number in even like even the most aggressive anti-communist propaganda outlets like the Black Book will mention that throughout a 60-year duration, the highest estimate that is totally like ridiculous that even other anti-Cuban, anti-Castro outlets do not agree with and put at like a third of that is still 15,000 over the course of 60 years versus 20,000 over the course of 7. So,
And we when we interviewed Cubans for our show, and I was going to say earlier that we were able to talk with Marta Nunez Sarmiento, who is a Cuban like sociologist and feminist scholar who we interview a bunch for the show, and she gave us a message that I kind of wanted to pass along and sum up briefly how she characterized it from on the ground. But I think that it's the like the sheer like the incongruity of those numbers is really striking. And even still, when you talk to Cubans and people who live in Cuba, they're willing to say like, yeah, like there are things that like shortcomings of the Cuban Revolution and shortcomings of our society. It's just that like and this is I think like a very good, it's part of why I think like the issue of Cuba, it can be a really good way to sort of help people think about like reorient their perspective about American action abroad more generally, right? Because it's like, well, hold on, what right do we have to tell this country to arrange its society in a different way? And what is the society that they want to build, and why are we so opposed to it? And Cuba presents that because of its success, because of the success it has had. It would be a very dangerous thing for people to hear about it.
yeah, it's a similar problem with like the inception of the Haitian Revolution as well. Like America has historically hated any sort of activity in the islands that were considered revolutionary because they were worried that like marginalized communities in the United States of America would see that, notice it, and also want to tailor their own movement. It's like a it's not a war necessarily out of genuine like national security concerns, but rather that this ideology, if mirrored here in the United States by marginalized people in a similar fashion, could be greatly damaging to the current hierarchy of power. So that is a part of the reason why America has always been involved in Cuba and also even in Haiti.
Yeah, and then to pull up the thing that Marta sent, because I do think it was really impressive. But here's how she, described it, and I'm quoting from here. Yesterday there were strangely rage outbursts at the same time in different cities, and criticizing blackouts, lack of food, and existing stores in hard currency. So meaning that like it's difficult for people to get the currency to buy goods they need, and that social media has broadly shown these things. And it's true that we are all exhausted after 16 months of the pandemic, plus the previous months of the worsening blockade since August 2019. And this is an important point. A lot of the recent difficulty that Cuba was facing even before the pandemic was because of intensified blockade and intensified economic and diplomatic measures against Cuba taken by the Trump administration. Part of this was just because of the Havana syndrome, and part of this was because when you get a Republican presidency, you can be, you can assume they'll do something bad beyond the normal level of badness that one would expect, I guess, as the mean. And so I think Marta also wanted to note, and this is the last thing I want to say, was that she personally links these with the uprisings with the events in Hades, and I want to be very careful about framing that, because I think it's just to say that like we don't have a lot of facts and things are all very fluid, but the Caribbean, and this is a whole region of the world. And America, like if you look at the New York Times front page today, Cuba in this story was not even at the top just a couple hours ago. It was still the assassination of the leader of Haiti in a plot that involves Haitian Americans and people with ties to mercenary companies and the whole lot. And all of it reeks very much of Venezuela and that stunt in the Trump years. So I think it's like the key point of which is to say I don't want to insinuate anything beyond that. Like people should be really reading this stuff with like a close and skeptical eye, because as Marta's pointing out, like they live there, and this kind of coordination and so on. She's not characterizing it as strange because Cuba is this totalitarian regime where nobody's allowed to think. It is not like it has stricter rules on free speech and free association than we do in America, for fucking sure. But even there, they're raising questions about this stuff as well, especially there.
Yeah. Um, how do you think Cuba will deal with this? Do you have any opinion on that, or if it's outside of your scope, it's fine as well? I mean, I'm seeing like propaganda. Like I am seeing immediately like what we always see, and you mentioned the New York Times. It's not like the headline, but immediately Biden calls Cuba protests clarion call for freedom. Like I mean, they are
the Biden. The problem is that like it's the fact that like Biden, I think, is the one that he is making an active statement is not a good, like it's not good. And it's unfortunate because obviously that will only like that like Biden puts out a statement, it emboldens other people. Like it's not good. It does not mean, however, like anything about what the situation is on the ground, because Biden could be calling these it's like what's Biden's motivation, like we don't know. And we don't have like reporting to anything to that effect yet, but it's like well Biden is like, like has to give a shit about a lot of, he's trying to get an infrastructure bill through. He's got a lot of domestic, this is another thing to think about with, like that I guess this thing that we've said in Blowback before. And it's a phrase I'm twisting from a thing that I read once written by the journalist Patrick Coburn, which is about the ways in which American domestic political priorities will change American foreign policy outcomes and decisions and actions and so on. And so, it's like, why is Biden doing all this? Like, it could be that he wants to, spur Cuban democracy on and so on. It could also be that he sees Marco Rubio getting, antsy on Twitter about it, and now he has to do something about it. So I think that it's part of what's important is to not like, there's not like we should be concerned, but like I'm not like exuding frenzy. And as to what Cuba's doing next, I would look at what, Prime Minister, President Miguel Diaz-Canel said today. There's a Telesur article, I'll just send it to you, that summarizes his remarks pretty well. And I think that it's good to sort of like, like try and go to the source with some of these people in terms of just like seeing what the, Cuban ministers and people are saying today. And I think that American media, because we'll call stuff like authoritarian, and we use those words not to actually describe a system in an honest or nuanced way, but because it's a way to negate and treat anything that they might say as suspect. And it's sort of like the challenge to everybody is to kind of like see past that and push past that to try and like consider the perspective of the country that we are nakedly launching such a brutal campaign against.
Yeah. By the way, with respect to the Cuban protests, the United States appropriations budget just allotted $20 million to the democracy projects in Cuba. And of the funds made available pursuant paragraph, not less than $5 million shall be made available for programs to support free enterprise and private business organizations, people-to-people educational and cultural activities. And for purposes of paragraph 2, the activities described in paragraph shall be considered democracy programs pursuant to section 7032C of this act, except that none of the funds made available under such paragraph may be used for assistance for the government of Cuba. So the irony of a lot of Americans trying to weaponize the protests that are happening right now, which are legitimate, it seems. I don't think it's like every time a fucking protest occurs in a country that America considers or that leftists consider to be like socialist or socialist adjacent, I don't immediately go, oh, CIA op, okay? I do think that people are probably frustrated. But the people are not demanding, please privatize our industries immediately. I would like to, instead of rely on the government, I would like to rely on free enterprise and capitalism. They want more government help. Like, that's what they're protesting. They're protesting for government help. Now, some of them might be protesting for free enterprise or what they understand is going to be more beneficial for them, but they want fucking food. They're not saying like, end communism. Because when you're hungry and you want more food, you're not going to be thinking about the ideological disagreements that you might have with the current government that you exist under. You just want fucking food.
Yeah.
So interesting that America is giving $20 million again to democracy programs in Cuba. And those programs are to support free enterprise and private business organizations.
And that's, by the way, just the money that is, on the books for what it's worth. I think that like one thing I would want to emphasize also is that, there's a lot of dark money swirling around this stuff at all times. I'll give one example. I don't think it's necessary to like name the group just offhand, but like they're also just because it's like, alphabet soup, but the group, for example, this past February, a bunch of Bob Menendez and a bunch of other political heavyweights, Rafael Diaz-Balart, the mayor of Miami. Although it should be noted, being the mayor of Miami is not like being the mayor of New York. The mayor of Miami is a more figurehead position. So that guy just is like his job is to just be annoying on in the media, at which he succeeds marvelously. And they had this event in February, and Bob Menendez streams in or whatever. And the guy who organizes it is a lawyer in private practice. And I look up his foundation, and it's not a registered nonprofit. It doesn't file anything about who it's disclosed to. Like you have these groups that operate, seemingly large institutions, and that are connected to, groups that do nakedly take money from the National Endowment for Democracy. One of the funding measures that's approved in the government, much like the one illustrated in the in the tweet you have up on the screen. And so it's like there's this, I guess the way to put it is that it's like, we have all these, like connections that we see the surface right here and in the language of the legislation, but it's not the whole picture. We're not getting the whole like picture of it, and that should be a point of concern. I think it's because it's dark money affects all parts of American political life. So there is like it's to the point about like not immediately assuming every protest is American astroturfed and so on. It's also like we should look at and try to make a point of seeing, and I hope that journalists are in the coming days are making the same kind of scrutiny of what are the American operations like active in these countries that might have some relationship.
I'm sure they'll do that. Actually, I think 100%. Glenn Greenwald is too busy. I don't know, getting mad at like a trans anarchist on Twitter to maybe offer some coverage to things like that. But those are more important subjects to cover, if you ask me. So I think that's what we're doing with like the left adjacent best investigative reporters on the left. So who knows? But I certainly am not waiting on Jake Tapper or anyone at CNN or MSNBC to offer broad coverage to American democratization programs in Cuba.
I mean, it is going to be, I think, a very like it's this is a political issue that like is very difficult to talk about historically because people don't know the truth, right? Like it would be a lot easier to defend the Cuban Revolution if we said, hey, it turns out Fidel Castro was not eating babies. They were actually teaching people to read, and we tried to kill the people teaching poor people to read because we did not like the way in which they nationalized industries and so on. Like, to make it a little, like that's like the cocktail napkin version of this or whatever. And I think once you start presenting people with the truer version of events and you tell them, well, no, this is what actually happened. And it helps form the basis for a better understanding of like, well, why do things work the way they do today? Because it's I mean, I guess to me, it's like these sorts of like it's all this like subterfuge and like what I can only describe as like this dark energy that's meant to cast a shadow over all this. I guess one of the advantages of I am fundamentally very optimistic about people's ability to kind of like see past the bullshit and really see the reality of the situation. And I'm not optimistic about the Democratic Party or anything, but like I believe in the capacity of people to force unwilling people with power to do stuff. And, I think that there are millions of people in Cuba whose lives, would be a lot better off for it.
Yeah. All right. Well, Noah, thank you so much for coming on, brother. This was an absolute treat. A lot of people are saying you're a tanky and that, you're not a credible source of information. I'm just kidding. Some people are saying that in the chat. What do you have to say to them?
I have to say to them, Blowback Season 2 is now available on all podcasts, not podcasts, airing weekly. If you want to listen to the whole show, Stitcher.com/premium. Sign up for a monthly plan. Use the promo code Blowback. But
Hell
otherwise,
yeah.
Monday mornings, it'll be in your feeds. And if you have complaints, don't send them to me. Just kidding. I am
Send them to Brandon.
grateful for anybody who listens.
Send them to Brandon.
And what about Brendan?
I'm saying send him to Brandon instead.
No, I want to give him a break. He's done a lot this season. Like his soundtrack, it fucking bangs, and that's also going live on the 30th. So I'm very much excited to also have that out in the world too.
Okay, yeah, and yes, as Noah already mentioned, you can find Noah at Wait, how do you? Dude, I always fuck up here.
Yeah, I'm just on at NKULW.
Yeah, it's really good. Really easy to remember Twitter name you got there, Noah.
Once upon a time, there was a character limit that mattered, and the ats were included in it. And so I guess this Zoomers won't. Your audience probably doesn't remember this era because they wouldn't use Twitter then. Like
yeah,
they don't use it
140
now.
character era.
Yeah. And so I don't think I've ever been accused of not being long-winded. So naturally I had to make space for my long-ass tweets.
Okay, well, people are spamming it right there. You can find them there. You can find them on Blowback. Blowback Season 1 was about Iraq, and Blowback Season 2, which is out now, is about Cuba and American propaganda, American involvement in Cuba. His microphone will be better on the podcast, so don't worry about that. Definitely check that out. Thank you for coming on, Noah.
Thanks.
All right, peace, brother. Peace. Like this video, please subscribe and hit that bell so you don't miss out on any future videos.